Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, messieurs, dames en heren, welcome, soyez les bienvenus. On behalf of Flagey and the Clara Festival, two organizations mobilizing all their creativity and energy to present a very special series of concerts covering 1,000 years of music, the Psalms Experience. 75 psalms, 3 choirs, 6 concerts during 3 days in the coming week. The Psalms Experience is a call for human dignity centered around 6 central themes: a mirror of today, trust, path of life, gratitude, authority, oppression. The 3 evenings of concerts next week will each start with a debate at 6:30. Philosophers, writers, and religious representatives will speak about the relevance of the Psalms today. And to introduce all this at once, religious and deeply humanitarian psalms, we decided to organize one big conference by an outstanding writer and thinker in this building that we see as a mental oasis where we regularly propose inspired moments of contemplation in our series Spreektijd, Pensez le présent, Moments of Being. We are extremely honored that Karen Armstrong has accepted our invitation to be our guest and share her views on perspective on the Psalms today. Karen Armstrong is, as you know, one of the most important voices in public debate worldwide, an authority and one of the most original thinkers on the role of religion. We are grateful that she has accepted our invitation to be with us in Brussels for this very special project. Welcome, Karen Armstrong. In your very wise book, 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life, you provide us with an impassioned and practical guide to helping us make the world a more compassionate place. You share concrete methods to help us cultivate and expand our capacity for compassion and provide a reading list to encourage us to hear one another's narratives. You teach us that becoming a compassionate human being is a lifelong project and a journey filled with rewards. Thank you for this. Ladies and gentlemen, Karen Armstrong is particularly well placed to tackle the fundamental questions of life. After having lived 7 years in a convent, she left the order in '69. She studied English at Oxford and taught modern English literature in London. She is the author of numerous books on religious affairs, including A History of God, The Battle for God, Holy War, Islam, Buddha, The Great Transformation, to name but a few. Her work has been translated into more than 40 languages, and exactly 10 years ago she was awarded the TED Prize. She used that occasion to call for the creation of a Charter for Compassion, crafted by leading thinkers in Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism, which was signed in the fall of 2009 by 1,000 religious and secular leaders. Next to Karen Armstrong is David van Reybrouck. And how proud we are with his presence as well, since our Belgian writer, on his turn, also has become a very important voice in international public debate. He is the writer of the widely translated books Congo, on our colonial history, and Against Elections, an essay resulting from his initiative to organize the quite controversial G1000, a platform for democratic innovation. David van Reybrouck once visited Karen Armstrong in London a whole day, which resulted in a beautiful interview published in the Standard. They will continue their conversation today, and we all have the privilege to be with them. Before we start the conversation, Karen Armstrong will give us a short lecture of 15 minutes. After the conversation, there will be occasion for some questions, short questions. And Karen Armstrong is happy also to sign her books, which you can buy in English, Dutch, French at the bookstores of our partners, Waterstones, Het Paard van Troje, and Tropisme. Karen Armstrong will have another meeting at 6 p.m. in another space here at Flagey, a meet and greet with only young generation. Some 150 young people from all over have prepared questions for her. Ladies and gentlemen, please applaud Karen Armstrong.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here in Brussels. Well, we're here to talk about the Psalms. Now, the Psalms are not ordinary hymns, and they're not ordinary poems. They're what we call scripture. And that puts them into a very distinctive genre altogether. I'm at the moment writing a book about scripture in all religious traditions, Chinese, Indian, as well as the monotheistic traditions. And I found that the genre of scripture in all these traditions has certain rules, which we're tending to forget about today. You go to scripture not to have your ideas confirmed or yourself programmed to be confirmed. You go to be transformed. The idea of transformation is very, very deep in religion. Religion hopes to change you. And we all want to be transformed, even if we only want to become slimmer or better looking. We are continually yearning to be other than we are. And scripture is a challenge that you take it into yourself and transform you. Now, how are we going to be transformed by the Psalms? Another thing that all the scriptures have in common, which we've slightly forgotten about in our secular society, is that all these traditions are meant to send you out into the world of action to change things and make things better. Secularism has been very wonderful in many ways, not least because it has liberated religion from the inevitable injustice and violence of the state. But it's also slightly damaged religion in making it something very private and special, something that's internal to you, that you pray and you have a personal relationship with God. You don't feel impelled to go out into the world and change it, which they all did. Even the Buddha, we think of Buddhism as a very internal sort of religion. Not at all. The Buddha sent out his monks and said, now go to the suffering world and go to help people suffering. And people are not doing that so much. If you think yoga now is a kind of aerobic exercise, or it helps you to be slimmer and fitter, it's not impelling you to go out there with a mission to change things and to be changed radically yourself. Even with the Charter for Compassion, I've found that people want their own little cities to be compassionate, but they don't want necessarily to reach out in our globalized world to other cities that are trying to make themselves compassionate cities. They want just to make their own world better. So what all the religions are also telling us is that every single one of them, whether it's Confucians or Taoists, Buddhists, Jews, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Jains, All of them insist that the essential virtue is compassion. And this is how we transform ourselves. Compassion, summed up in the golden rule, never treat others as you would not like to be treated yourself, means you have to dethrone yourself from the center of your world and put another there. It's a way of getting beyond the self and putting yourself in the shoes of another. Even, as Jesus said, your enemies. And our world is now so dangerously polarized that compassion is now not just a nice idea, but it's an urgent global imperative. So now, how are we going to sort of make the Psalms transform us and answer these canons that is demanded of Scripture? Well, if you just take a look around our world, we are failing massively on two fronts. Number one is inequity in the world. Nearly all the troubles, the terrorism, comes from a sense of profound inequality in our world. That is quite clear. And we've never, despite all our fine talk about equality, we've never managed to create a truly equitable state. And secondly, there's the environment. Last year, carbon levels reached an unprecedented level. Now, one of the things, the actions of the Scriptures in the East is to give something back to the fragile cosmos, and this created an attitude of concern for the environment, which we haven't managed to do in the same way. And similarly, the whole question of inequity, social justice, is fundamental to the three monotheisms, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Now, the Psalms. Not all these Psalms are cozy and pleasant. Some of them are furious. I was telling people at lunch that when I was a nun, we used to chant the Psalms through and through in Latin every week. But there came the terrible moment when the Vatican Council decreed that we had to turn it into English. And if you can imagine a room, a whole chapel full of very restrained, polite English nuns, warbling politely, "Oh God, smash their teeth in their mouths," you'll see that we could not go on for a while. Now, how do we deal with that? First of all, we've all recognized we've all got that anger in us that bubbles up at the most extraordinary moments. But B, there are a lot of angry people in the world. Some of us, our enemies, so-called, are angry, and they have good reason, some of them. Let us, as we listen to those Psalms, put ourselves into the place, have in your mind a certain troublesome part of the world where people are angry, and identify with that anger. Take yourself out of yourself and put another there. Secondly, there are sorrowful Psalms. St. Mark puts that terrible psalm, my God, why have you deserted me?" on the lips of Jesus, his last words on the cross. Terrible dereliction. Every time we turn on the news and we see pictures of what's going on in Syria or the Yemen, again, open your mind and heart and take that psalm, enter in to the people of Syria, perhaps to one Syrian person that you've seen on the news. Identify with that person and feel that sorrow with her and make it your own. And finally, with the environment. Way back in 1993, the scientists of the world said we have to re-sacralize our world. sacrality means that we are filled with awe and reverence for people and for the natural world, that it fills us with awe. Now, there are psalms that sing of the glories of creation. When you hear those in these concerts, try and think, how can we sacralize our world and save it from destruction? And you know, one of the things that we've never achieved yet is to find a rational, secular justification for human rights. People are puzzling about this. If we are just, as the scientists tell us, a bunch of electroids and gristle, why should we have any more rights than a tortoise? What all the scriptures try to do is to, every single one of them, divinizes the human condition, sees a human being, sees the human being as potentially sacred. And as we sing these psalms, let us try to find practical ways of going out from our concerts to sacralize our world, to honor all people, whoever they are, and see them as profoundly mysterious and sacred, as well as our natural world. When I see the heavens, the works of your hands, the moon and the stars that you arranged, what is man that you should think of him? Mortal man that you should care for him. To have that sense of humility before the magnitude of the cosmos and our profound sense of our responsibility for it and for our suffering, angry neighbors on this planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen Armstrong. It's a great honor, ladies and gentlemen, to be able to talk not only to one of the great thinkers of our age, but also to one of the kindest persons I know. You were so kind to sing even a part of a psalm. Would you be able to sing Psalm 147 as well? Do you remember it?
No.
Well, nor did I. But today's discussion is the ongoing relevance of the Psalms, and preparing this interview, I didn't know that they could be so topical and so up to date. Here are 3 verses from Psalm 147. He sends out, do you want to read it perhaps?
No, I haven't got my glasses.
Okay, I do. He sends out his command to the earth. His word runs swiftly. He gives snow like wool. He scatters frost like ashes. He hurls down his crystals of ice like crumbs. Who can stand before his cold? Ladies and gentlemen, you did, because you made it on this wintry day that we have here. Which is just to show you the ongoing relevance of the Psalms, even in climatic conditions. Now, Karen, when were they written, the Psalms?
They were written over a varied period of time. Some of them are very old indeed, probably dating back to the time of King Solomon.
Right.
And there's some of the Psalms that have been applied to Jesus, that were applied by Christians to Jesus, that were in the old coronation hymns.
Right.
Where the king, the new king of Israel, was adopted by Yahweh as his son, and became a member of the divine council. So you have, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand, and while I make your enemies your footstool, I'll be on your side now. And he says, you are my son, this day I have begotten you. These were later applied to Jesus. So these are very, very old.
Very old ones. Which century are we talking about
We're
then?
talking probably about the 9th, 10th century BCE.
Yeah.
Others go forward some 100 years. By the waters of Babylon, there we sat and we wept. That's 6th century. when the Israelites had been taken off into captivity and were all exiled into Babylon. They had force-marched 500 miles away after Jerusalem had been destroyed. A terrible time of their history. And that's one of those angry psalms. It all sounds lovely, and there's, I think, the pop song we made of it.
Boney M.
Yes, but it finishes up, daughters of Babylon. And this we completely flummoxed us when we sang it in the convent, you destroyer. Happy is he who takes your little ones and dashes their heads against a rock.
The topic of today is also compassion. We'll come back to that later because it's a big leap now.
But there it is. That's the exile's fury and anguish and the horror and the trauma of exile, which helps them to put their scriptures together. It's in that time that the exiles put together what we now know as the first 5 books of the Bible.
Is it therefore the word of God or the word of humans addressing their God?
I think they're both. It's both. I don't think you can think about God without thinking human, or human without thinking God. The prophets spoke in God's name, and those exiles were expressing very much their own anger and their own homesickness. By the waters of Babylon, there we sat and we wept when we remembered Zion, and their homesickness. And the horror of this and the impotence of it. So this is a human voice. But you see, I don't think you can separate human divine. And this is one of the problems we've had with God in our world, in our modern world. We have separated them very much. When people talked, that bit you just wrote about seeing God as a force of nature.
Snow, ice,
and also
frost.
for the Israelites, a force in history that is somehow propelling them forward in historical events. And continually, in China, you can't think about God without thinking about the earth and what they call heaven, which is really the whole cosmic order. They call it the Three Trinity. And the whole point of incarnation, where you have a divinized human being, because we are human beings. She says brilliantly. I mean, we can't. If we were ants, we would have a God that was more like an ant. We construct a God in our own image, but then realize how utterly inadequate this is.
And then we say he created us in his image.
Yes, but this is a façon de parler. We are so literal in our age. You know, if he says he created it, it's like a sort of conjuring trick. Whoomph, out it comes. But there are two quite separate accounts of creation put side by side next to one another in the Bible. Which are incompatible. They're just saying this is a façon de parler, way of talking about how God is some kind of origin of us all.
They are written between the 10th century and roughly the 3rd
and then
century.
Later, and so much later into the Hellenistic period.
That's right.
That have definitely been absorbed by the learning they've acquired from the Greeks.
That's right. Well, some of them are written after Socrates and after Aristotle.
Oh, well, but
centuries after.
Yes, certainly, and because they were learning all the time. Some of them would be used too in the education of elite Israelites. The way education was conducted in the ancient world was that you were given texts, sometimes very ancient texts, and you had to memorize them and make them a part of yourself, and that gave you the ethos of the ruling class. And some of those psalms about Solomon, etc., some of the songs about the Exodus, about Yahweh rescuing his people, these would have been learned by heart and memorized to create a kind of national identity.
Many of them have been ascribed to David and to Solomon, obviously with an authorship stretching 8-9 centuries. That's stretching his lifetime quite a bit.
Yes, indeed. But this is a kind of another façon de parler, because it was quite common in the ancient world to pursue wisdom, and the king was always the sage par excellence. It happened to be Solomon.
Right.
And so and in other parts of the China, they look back to great kings of the ancient period as sages. The epitome, the embodiment of wisdom, the embodiment of the ideal that we're all striving for.
But were they written to be read in private, like we have with most poetry? Were they written to be performed?
Performed. Scripture is a performative art. It's always been performed. I mean, most people until the 18th century couldn't read.
Right.
That's the simple fact of the matter. You listened to your scriptures and you sang them. This is very important because singing and music activates a different part of the brain, the right hemisphere, which is more intuitive than the left hemisphere, which is the sphere of language and analysis, what we need for science.
Logic.
And logic. We need both these, but the whole musical element, it gave it an emotive power too. And also ritual. In the Protestant world, ritual has got severely downgraded. It was a big mistake, because always, every single religion helps you to take these psalms into your body. So you sing them, you act them out, and they become a part of your consciousness. But
it's very physical, it's
very
corporeal.
Physical. And religion has become far too much of a head trick with us, cerebral. It's a lot of this is about embodiment. The monks who used to in Europe, who used to sing the psalms, 150 psalms every week in the divine office, they would have something called divine study, Lectio Divina, where for 2 or 3 hours a day they would memorize scripture, but not just learn, but they learnt it by saying it aloud. And they called this rumination.
Rumination, just like a cow would do with grass.
They actually
rehash, you ruminate.
Because it goes into you and it becomes a part of you. And then sometimes, when you need to speak it out, it returns to the mouth.
Right.
So this is a very physical activity.
So what happens to your body the time where you were singing, "Oh Lord, please smash their teeth"?
When you see that by this time, religion had become such a head trip with us.
Yeah, right.
That what we did have the liturgy, which was singing, and it involved the smell of incense, and it involved acting, but it was very, very much a head trip.
As a nun, I think as any person in a monastic order, you'd be singing the 150 psalms every week. I mean, you go through the whole book every week. Do we know anything about the rituals in which they were originally used in terms of Judaism?
Yes, certainly. It's the ones I've mentioned already in the coronation ceremony, a lot of them were sung by pilgrims, the ones about Jerusalem. Jerusalem built like a city into one perfect whole. Here come the tribes. God is here, they said.
People would go on pilgrimage to the city of Jerusalem.
From all over Palestine, and later from all over the Jewish diaspora. They would come to the immense temple built by King Herod in the 1st century BCE. Drew pilgrims, and they would sing as they were going along the route about Jerusalem. And there was, and with King David, who founded the Davidic monarchy in Jerusalem by conquering it from the Jebusites, the Hittite people, they developed a whole ethos of how Jerusalem was impregnable. That God is here, say the Psalms. Jerusalem built like a city, and up here come the tribes of the Lord. Right. And this, of course, proved not to be the case, right, when Jerusalem was smashed and destroyed by enemies, right, which was a great... so losing the temple was like a tremendous blow to the whole religious ethos. So they would sing them very much on subs and on pilgrimage, but some of them would have been for the elite only, the more
really?
Yes,
right,
who were learning. Some of the psalms are alphabetically
right,
done.
yes.
That's an aid memoir,
right,
to help the student remember all this stuff.
Right.
And that would have been only right, for members right, of the aristocracy.
It's a reaction to violence. They also contain a lot of violence. We're just talking about it. God shall likewise destroy thee forever, Psalm 52. Psalm 55, destroy, O Lord, and divide their tongues, for I have seen violence and strife in the city. It's interesting. As a response to violence, the faithful is calling for violence, yes, is asking for violence.
Which is what we do. We're still doing it. The Iraq War, for example.
Revenge, exactly.
Yes. You know, what's changed? This is what we are.
Right.
Instead of saying, yo, perhaps we're up the wrong path here. Right. No, we make things worse.
We make things worse. Did you speak to Tony Blair about this topic?
We communed. I had one unfortunate, just nonsensical conversation with him, but he did come out a couple of years ago with the idea that he was going to reform Islam. He could see that it had a theological problem, and he announced on the BBC World Service that he was going to sort it out. And the BBC asked me to come along the following week, right, to, as it were, to answer this, which I did. I was going to be present in the London Hilton at a meeting he was holding with Shimon Peres and right, people to put this into practice, but my name got dropped from the list.
And do you know why?
He'd heard the broadcast, of course, because listen, you can't go in and reform. Besides, Tony Blair is not the most popular person in the Middle East.
And right, indeed, and perhaps not the greatest study of Muslim theology on earth either.
But you see, that's the arrogance that we have, and people are always telling me, "Oh well, but the trouble with Islam is," and out they come with. But if you actually study it, you realise it's far more complex, and it's embarrassing to listen to this. Right. Really, right. We need, you know, the problem is not Islam. The problem is your result of colonialism, the result of secularization, which in the Middle East, which has been often imposed very, very cruelly. The Shahs used to make their soldiers go out with their bayonets, ripping off women's veils in the streets. On one occasion, the Shah gave his police orders to shoot at hundreds of unarmed demonstrators in one of the holiest shrines of Iran who were peacefully protesting against obligatory Western dress. Hundreds of Iranians died that day. So secularism, which we've experienced as something wonderful and freeing and liberating, has been experienced as a devastating blow and as a foreign import.
As well.
So that, you know, and you know too well, the legacy that colonialism, modern colonialism, left behind, we British did too. When I went first to Palestine in the 1980s to make a television series about St. Paul, I didn't know much at all about the Middle East. But in conversation with both Israelis and Palestinians, I found the one thing they had in common was how awful the British had been. And I began to see this is not just the Middle East problem, it's our problem too.
You demonstrate a lot of understanding and you show a lot of empathy for the anger, which is all too human. In the Psalms, we also see that anger, even hatred, can give rise to fantastic poetry.
Yes.
Can I quote one more of these beautiful lines? It's perhaps one of my favorite lines. It's a terrible line, but it is a beautiful line. consume them in wrath, consume them. What does the word consume mean in this context? Not just eat them, or
eat them, and also devour them, so that
devour them,
so that they're shriveled, and then they don't exist anymore.
Consume them in wrath, consume them that they may not be. And at evening, let them return and let them make a noise like a dog and go around about the city.
Yes.
Do we sufficiently understand the beauty of these writings as well?
Well, it's like Greek tragedy.
Exactly.
Where
Yes.
you are looking at absolute horror.
Yeah.
Because we have to look into horror, all of us. And perhaps even the creation of something beautiful like that out of it
Right.
is a form of catharsis, a way of. It's no good denying it or saying, oh, well, they meant well or they didn't mean it, or you feel that anger. And sometimes you need to get it out, otherwise it starts corroding and poisoning and everything you do. We've all been there, I think, where we've nurtured a resentment and perhaps kept it to ourselves, and it corrodes us from inside. Get it out. And also own it, that is what we feel. We're not all noble people who are above things and can. We are angry, deeply flawed, and a very violent species.
Is it good for the well-being of humanity that we recognize that violence inside?
Yes, I think so. We have to recognize it. Otherwise, we're going around in a sort of dream. We're always talking about how lovely and peaceable we are in the West. We're not. And nobody is. All our states and all our civilizations have been founded on violence and injustice.
And is that one of the reasons why these psalms have inspired so many composers? I can hardly imagine any book in the Bible that has drawn the attention from composers the likes of Bach, Purcell, Monteverdi, Arvo Pärt, you name Boniem, you name them.
Yes.
They've inspired centuries and centuries of artists.
Yes, I think they're things that we hear from a young age too. Perhaps not so much now, but certainly there's something that you grow up with, some of these psalms. And so they are familiar and they are a part of you. And that's our culture.
Right.
Other scriptures will have had other resonances, like the Quran.
Or the Mahabharata or
yes,
whatever.
And the Quran is a case in point where people are sort of reading it now. Like, and Tony Blair said to me, well, I've read the Quran. And you haven't read the Quran. You listen to the Quran. It's a performance. It's a work of art to sing the Quran, to recite the Quran. It's a recitation. And it's a form of music. And without that, it isn't anything. It's sound, and just as the earliest scriptures were all about sound and not so much about meaning at all in India.
You've been reciting them yourself quite a few times. I mean, you spent 7 years in convent, yes?
Yeah.
And so 50 times a week. So you've been singing each one of these psalms at least 350 times.
Yes, some of them have gone in one ear out the other, I think. But some of them have stayed with me.
Like which one?
Out of the depths I have called unto you, O Lord. De profundis clamavi ad te, Domine. Domine exaudi vocem meam.
You start tapping your feet as you recite them.
And,
This is how physical it is?
Yes. And, of course, that's the whole thing about music. That music always wants you to get up and dance, to tap your feet.
Right.
And I was reading a Chinese sage, 10th century BC, Chinese sage, CE, Chinese sage, a Neo-Confucian, who said that when you read these scriptures, you can read them with your head, and some people read a little bit and they also get it with their heart. But some people read these scriptures so that they dance with their hands and feet.
Something similar has just happened.
So that it should fill you with a sense of exaltation. But we've made it into a reading this psalm. But these but music, and they would have been sung. It is it goes. We had at the British Museum, where we went on our last meeting, a concert in the evening in the Parthenon room. Was the B minor Mass of Bach, and here is Bach, a Protestant, writing a Catholic Mass. One of the most beautiful Catholic Masses ever done. And, you know, the whole room is sort of shaking. And that's what Scripture, how it was conceived. And that when you discussed it...
As music, as performance.
As music, as performance, and as or with the rabbis, intense discussion. So that you argued about it, and that you imagined that you were standing together with Moses on Mount Sinai. This was whenever you spoke these words, the rabbi said, and took the scriptures on to another level to make it say something new, you were continuing the conversation physically that began on Sinai.
Was there a lot of room for that type of conversation when you were in the convent?
No, none at all. By this time, you see, I entered at the same time as the Vatican Council was meeting.
How old were you then?
I was 17.
17.
And I entered in 1962. And so I got the old system, which had outrun itself at its last gasp, and probably at its worst.
Really?
It was very damaging.
To you or to the church?
Me. I was a complete wreck when I came out. Yes, after 7 years, I broke down, and mentally, physically, I just cried, couldn't stop. I kept saying, I can't do this. And then I had to make the big, terrifying decision to leave, which was hugely difficult.
You were 24 then? You were a very young girl?
Yes. And then coming out into the world was just awful. You see, we were kept from the news, so we never knew what was going on.
No Vietnam War?
I'd never heard of it.
No JFK
I left in
being shot?
1969, and I'd never heard of Vietnam. I'd never heard of the Beatles. There, I was at Oxford, and students. When I'd entered in 1963, we were all still very good little girls, looking rather like our mothers with twin sets and pearls. And there were they all in jeans and everything, protesting, youth protesting. Now, imagine us young nuns protesting about anything in the convent would have been extraordinary.
I thought that your decision to leave the convent had been inspired by the events of '68, but
no.
Now you tell me you were completely unaware of it.
No, I didn't know anything about it, no.
How come? Were there other people in your convent breaking with it as well?
They did tell us about the Cuba crisis, which was just after we entered.
Right.
And they thought, as the world was about to sort of disintegrate, they'd better mention it. But then they forgot to tell us that the crisis had been resolved.
Oh, right.
And we were never allowed to ask for news of the world.
So in '69 you were asking about Pigs Bay?
No. After 3 weeks, one of us cracked at recreation and said, is there any more news about Cuba? And she, didn't we tell you? How silly of us. We all gazed at her balefully. We'd had 3 more weeks of Cuba than anyone else on the globe. So that was how isolated we were.
How come you became a Roman Catholic in a country which is predominantly known as a Protestant country?
We were Irish.
Ah, there you are.
I lived in a kind of Irish ghetto because...
Your parents, were you born in Ireland? Or?
No, but my father came over from Ireland at the age of 2 in 1900.
Really?
And my mother's family came over at the potato famine time.
Oh, in 1842?
Yes.
43?
So the Catholicism is very un-British.
Exactly.
So we formed a very sort of tight ghetto-like existence, and mixed only with Catholics, and went to Catholic schools and everything.
So how do I need to imagine Karen Armstrong in her late 20s then? The first years, people were wearing bell-bottom trousers and smelling of patchouli,
No,
and there you
not
are.
quite. It was miniskirts.
With miniskirts?
Which
Did you have one?
I had to. That was all there was in the shop. And, and a group of very nice students came out with me in my habit to buy this stuff because I was at college and the dispensation came through. And they were delighted. They loved this, of course, take me to Marks and Spencer's.
Right.
And I had a skirt that came down to where my vest had been, you know, as short as that. And it was just awful, all this. And then my hair had to show, and I'd been swathed in black, etc. And it was all very, very alarming and sad. I felt very, very sad.
You felt sad in the convent, but you also felt sad in
to be leaving and frightened.
And
yes.
frightened.
Yes, I didn't know how I was going to manage. But you see, if I hadn't been in the convent, I wouldn't be here talking to you tonight.
But you didn't leave the convent to become a world authority on religion, I think.
No, I wanted to be a professor of English literature.
Really?
And for the first 50 years of my life, every 6 years there was a complete disaster. 7 years in the convent, broke down, out. Then I tried to become an academic and failed my Oxford doctorate with great publicity. It was incorrectly examined, apparently.
Really?
Yes, and they wouldn't let me have it re-examined because it would vitiate the sanctity of the doctorate.
The world-leading authority on religion
failed her
PhD
yes.
at Oxford.
Yes.
Do they regret it by now?
No, they studiously ignore me.
Really?
Yes.
Even now?
Yes, but I don't mind. I'm very glad I'm not an English professor and have done what I did. And then I went away and I wanted nothing to do with religion for years. But it was that visit to Jerusalem in 1982 to make that documentary about St. Paul. I encountered Judaism and Islam in Jerusalem. And I started studying these religions. I was making other television programs, and I started to see things in these faiths that I could relate to.
Interesting.
But which also told me what my own tradition had been trying to do at its best.
What were these things then?
For what I liked about Judaism was that you never stop asking questions. That you never, like we Catholics had to do, take these dogmas for truth. You keep on questioning. It goes back to the rabbis. Nobody has the last word. Keep on asking questions.
Curiosity.
And objecting and taking things forward. And in Islam, what I found was its appreciation and respect for other faiths. The Quran, which is often sort of so misunderstood, has passages in which it says that in order to be a Muslim, you must also respect the prophecies of Jesus and Moses and Noah and Aaron and David and all the scriptures that have come before. Because the Arabs had no idea of an exclusive religion.
Right.
That came in later, of course, but as it always does.
That seems to have been completely forgotten now in popular representations.
Except that, when I'm speaking in I often go to Pakistan. And the person who invites me to come and speak in Pakistan always asks me to end with a particular quotation from 12th century mystic Ibn Arabi. And he says, it goes like this: "Do not praise your own faith so exclusively that you disbelieve all the rest. If you do this, you will miss much good. Nay, you'll fail to recognize the real truth of the matter. God, the omnipresent and omniscient, cannot be confined to any one creed. For he says in the Quran, 'Wheresoever ye turn, there is the face of Allah.' Everybody praises what he knows. His God is his own creature. And in praising it, he praises himself. Consequently, he blames the beliefs of others, which he would not do if he were just, but his dislike is based on ignorance." And my friend always says that you can see the audience relaxing. And I spoke at a big conference of of Palestinian doctors in the United States in the summer. And people were applauding at the end of every phrase of that, because that's what, after one of my talks, one man got up and said, that's what we used to hear in the mosque. And now we don't hear it anymore. A Saudi influence, Deobandi influence, has introduced a much drastically narrower version of Islam that has, and they've had the petrodollars and international support to do that. It's as if a tiny Bible Belt sect in the United States had petrodollars and international support to support its peculiar form of Christianity all over the world.
Right.
And that has very much distorted the tradition.
You not only moved from Roman Catholicism to Christianity, from Christianity to Judaism and Islam, in later years you've also started to tackle the religions from the Indian subcontinent and from China.
Yes.
We're talking about Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, Confucianism, and a number of religions we've never heard of. How do you explain for yourself that sort of, I wouldn't call it an imperial expansion of your research interest, but the growing field of expertise?
Because I find them so inspiring.
Right.
Confucianism is, I could imagine myself as a Confucian.
Really?
Yes. It's
Why is
all
that?
about reverence for the human being, reverence for the environment, so a reverence that is enacted, embodied in rituals that teach the body at a level deeper than the rational, to give absolute respect to every human being. As I said earlier, that they have this concept of heaven, earth, and humanity as single, as a indissoluble partnership.
But it's not a religion in the sense that is comparable with the theology of the religions of the Middle East.
It's not like monotheism.
Right.
But monotheism is only one expression of religion.
That's right. That's right.
And it's certainly empathy. It's all about empathy and compassion.
It's all about empathy.
And compassion.
You've also written, you've done the impossible. Well, you've done the impossible by writing these pile of impressive, impeccably researched books. And then you've written the biography of a man whose life we don't know anything about, which is your biography of the Buddha. This is a tour de force unimaginable. After having read that book, I was convinced that deep down you are a Buddhist.
No, I'm not good enough at meditation.
Yeah.
Meditation, we had to meditate in the convent.
How was that?
I couldn't do it. It was a form of Jesuit meditation, an Ignatian meditation, which just wasn't for me.
So what is Jesuit Ignatian meditation?
It's
You need to
St.
flog
Ignatius
yourself?
taught, you have to take a passage, and we had to write down the night before we were going to meditate about the next day.
A passage from the New Testament? Or
Anything, from the New Testament. You take a scene, and first of all, you sort of imagine this biblical scene, physically, as you think, you imagine the sand dunes and the braying donkeys and the senses, getting a sense of it. Then you take that's the senses. Then you exercise the intellect, where you think about it in 3 points. And then at the end of it, from that, you take a resolution that you will act out that day, to embody it, incorporate it. I couldn't do it. My mind, I can concentrate for hours at a time at my books every day. But I'd just get into my knees and my head would go skittering off down all these alleyways. I could not somehow fit to point 1, 2, and 3 and then out at the end. And I just couldn't, and it left me with a sort of phobia about meditation.
a phobia of meditation?
And then during breakfast we had to examine, we had 10 questions, how did I do in meditation while we were having our cornflakes or whatever. And you know, and I didn't have to ask. I didn't have to ask myself these 10 questions. It was just 0, 0, 0 down the line, and that was it.
How would the Buddha have assessed this particular form of meditation?
He would have said it was unskillful, I think.
Unskillful.
But it would have been unskillful for an Indian, or it was unskillful for me.
Right.
It just wasn't my cup of tea, but you had to do it that way.
Right.
Now, I think now I would have been told, do it your own way, find your own way. But it left me with a kind of, I am more like Lectio Divina, divine study. When I'm studying, I will get moments of awe, or just mini-seconds of what St. Benedict called oratio, or prayer. Just you're involved intensively, and you just get an aha moment.
Would you call this a moment of grace?
No, just a moment of insight. Something touches you within, and it seems to chime with what you're reading, and you seem to get a glimpse of a larger whole.
Would you still describe yourself as a religious person?
Yes, yes, I would. I'm spending my entire life, right from 9 in the morning until 6 at night, involved in these sacred texts.
It's almost a monastic lifestyle.
It is. And it's, in a sense, I think it's probably what I was looking for when I went into the convent.
Yeah.
And I seem to have found it now.
Would you describe yourself still as a Christian or a Roman Catholic,
No.
or are you beyond that?
No, I can't. Because if I did that, they'd be after me to say this was the best. I can't see any one of these faiths as any better than any of the others.
How do you see them then?
I see all of them as paths going to an inexpressible truth in different ways, with each has its own genius.
Right.
And each its particular failings.
How do you feel about atheism then?
Fine, as long as it's not filled with hate and disdain.
Right.
Because a lot of, when I was writing my book, History of God, I kept on finding people like Thomas Aquinas saying we cannot say that God exists. Maimonides said the same thing, because our notion of existence is far too limited.
Right.
We only know existing things that are temporary, that sicken and die and are flawed in some way. God is being, God, says Thomas Aquinas, is being itself, esse se ipsum, being itself, what Heidegger said. And so it's...
the fact of existing.
The whole, and the ancient Indians and the Chinese, they had gods, but that was not the God, or what we call God. It was the whole of reality, the whole of being that fills you with awe, that you get glimpses of from time to time, that music can, the words tend to tie it down too much and to define it.
We're back to music. The people of the Clara Festival will be happy to hear so. But you've been dealing with religions from Europe, from the Middle East, North Africa, Indian subcontinent, China. You've never written, as far as I know, about religions in pre-colonial Africa or pre-colonial Americas. Is there a reason for that?
No, I just haven't got round to it yet.
Right. It is not that you despise them.
Oh, no. Good heavens, no. I don't know much about the African religions, but what I've encountered among the Native Americans is profound.
Right.
Profound. It's just that they probably don't have texts that help me to get into it, or those kind of academic histories that get you started. Which is probably why I'd probably need to be an anthropologist.
That's right.
Like, to go and live with these
that
people.
material.
Yes.
In 2008, Sigrid Brousset said it in her introduction, you were invited to give a TED Talk. Now, TED is a highly popular event. Your talk was particularly extremely well watched. You were defending the idea that underlying these enormously different religious traditions, there is one central principle, the golden rule. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
I found, and this became very clear to me when I was writing a book called The Great Transformation, which is a great change that occurred in religion in various parts of the world. Every one of them comes back to that. That Confucius was the first person to enunciate the golden rule as we know it. He was asked by his disciples, and this is about 5th century BCE, Master, which of your teachings can we put into practice all day and every day? All day and every day. And which is the central thread that runs through all your teachings and pulls it all together? And Confucius said perhaps it's what he called shu, which means likening to the self. Look into your own heart, discover what gives you pain, and then refuse under any circumstance whatsoever to inflict that pain on anybody else. Never impose on others what you yourself do not desire. Because that means you go beyond the self. Hillel, an older contemporary of Jesus, was approached by a pagan who promised to convert to Judaism if Hillel could recite the whole of Jewish teaching while he stood on one leg. And Hillel stood on...
Strange way of examining somebody.
Indeed. And Hillel stood on one leg and said, that which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow human being. That is the Torah, and everything else is only commentary. Go and study it. Everything else is just a commentary on the golden rule. Jesus had the golden rule. Muhammad, not one of you can be a believer, said the prophet, unless he desires for his neighbor what he desires for himself. Not one of you, he said, can sleep. Not one of you can be a believer if he can sleep when he knows that someone is hungry. And we, with our knowledge of starving people around the world, should all be sleepless, worrying about that. And yet, with the TED, I said the trouble is you never hear about this. Because often when religious leaders come together, they're either condemning something, a doctrine, or you know, laying down the law about something, but you don't hear about, and this is what the world needs. Because unless now we learn to treat everybody on the planet, whether we like them or not, as we would wish to be treated ourselves, the world is not going to be a viable place. It's not just a nice idea. It's now essential for the survival of our species.
It's a profoundly secular idea as well. It
Yes.
doesn't need any deity, it doesn't
No.
need any god.
But what it yields is a sense of transcendence.
That's right.
Because if you're doing it all day and every day, I mean, in England, we have this habit of saying, when we've done something nice for somebody, well, that's my good deed for the day. So that we can then return to the next 23 hours through our usual habits of selfishness and unkindness. No, all day and every day, every moment of the day, you are putting yourself in someone else. You're leaving the ego behind.
Right.
And it's that egolessness that gives one a sense of the divine.
Exactly.
And that's why it's a practice that if inculcated, it gives you leave the self behind, which is what ecstasy is, standing outside the self. And it's much safer than doing all these chants and things.
Right.
Because but now I just feel this urgency because we've got now to ensure that there's more equity in the world. Civilization has always been unequal. Agrarian civilization, where the economy depended on agriculture, in every single civilization of the world, a tiny minority, an aristocracy, comprising about 2% of the population, with their retainers, soldiers, servants, etc., forced 90% of the population, the peasants, to live at subsistence level, taking away their produce and using it to fund their cultural activities. And historians tell us that without this iniquitous system, we would probably have remained at a primitive level because it created a privileged, leisured class that could develop the arts and sciences on which our progress had depended. Now, we talk about equality in our world, and the founding fathers, for example, said it's a self-evident truth that all men are created equal, but it didn't apply to the Native Americans, and it didn't apply to the African slaves.
Exactly.
And it didn't apply to the colonized peoples. But in the old days, the peasants lived so separately from the aristocracy, they couldn't imagine what their lives were.
Their life was like.
In China, they lived in subterranean dwelling pits.
That's right.
And they didn't enter the towns where the civilization was. Now we flaunt our wealth with our online and in our films, and people see it. And there's rage, and also we've gone in and interfered with countries, as certainly Britain did, and used them for our own ends, and just extracted stuff from them, and with Islam, which had been a great world power, overnight reduced to a dependent bloc. This was a great trauma.
You mean the colonization of the Arab world?
Yes, and the Muslim world in general. And someone asked me just a couple of months ago, a Muslim said, you say every religion has its own flaws, its own particular failings. What do you think Islam's failing is? And I said, you're finding it very hard not to be a world power. Because unlike Jesus, who was finished up on a cross, Muhammad was a stunning success.
As a political leader as well.
Political leader, spiritual leader, united, and and all the people, it's important to notice this, historians of warfare say he's one of the only empire builders who did so mostly by diplomacy rather than fighting.
That's right.
But he pacified the whole of this Arabia, which is a bunch of warring tribes, and within 60 years of his death, Muslims owned the largest empire the world had ever seen. And then suddenly to be reduced to this, it's a profound, and it came with science. We introduced science to them, and it came with this sense of profound humiliation. And the way I don't know how the Belgians behave, but certainly the British. I read what Lord Cromer would say about the Oriental. You know, he can't think properly. He's lazy. He's primitive.
Right.
And this was how we made people feel. So it's left this, plus modernization, and the oil has been like, in the Arab world, has been like the wizard's curse. Because
reduced political power, increased economic resources has made for the Saudi Arabian scenario you just described.
Well, it's also made them the product of the object of the world's greed. And we've supported awful regimes in there in order to get oil. And, you know, this is, I mean, Tony Blair was saying, and some people have, you know, when he had this idea of reforming the Muslim world, he said some of them are reforming. He said, I mean, I'm really impressed by Saudi Arabia. I gave a sort of hollow laugh. Because this, I mean, it's been a disaster.
It is,
so, you know, I don't know how we're going to get out of this mess.
Well, you moved the way forward by after your TED talk, you were giving a TED prize, and you used that prize to bring together religious leaders from all over the world to draft the Charter for Compassion.
Yes.
And even certain, not only about 3 million citizens have signed it by now?
Yes, I'm not that interested in people signing it, because, you know, something comes up online and you put it on and it's easy.
I've done my good deed for the day. I've signed Karen Armstrong's Charter for Compassion.
And then you've forgotten about it.
Right.
I've been very concerned that it should be practical. And I was talking up there about how we made it all a sort of, some people are just sitting around in a self-indulgent way having appreciation days when they sort of all get together and say, I really appreciate you. And I think, for heaven's sake, you know, there's a world out there in pain. So what we've been trying to do and the best thing that's happened has been the idea of cities of compassion, where the mayor...
Cities of compassion.
Cities of compassion, where the mayor endorses the charter, but they have to have a practical program, something that the community needs. Some people focus on homelessness. In Louisville, for example, they've got a Holiday Inn, which they put at the disposal of the homeless, a fully functioning hotel, and they can stay there.
We have a mayor who took money from the homeless. I don't think Brussels could qualify as a city of compassion.
The best of these cities is Karachi.
Karachi?
Karachi.
Pakistan.
Pakistan. They have... the mayor endorsed it. They are concentrating on education. They've now got 24,000 students going through in schools of compassion, and they're going to have 5,000 schools of compassion throughout. Now, this means that they got educationalists, leading educationalists, to introduce compassion into core subjects of the curriculum, like history, politics, English language, Urdu language, how we speak to one another, for example, and how we use language. And also, because trying to integrate the vast gulf that exists in Pakistan between rich and poor. So one of the things they're doing, their latest project, it's called Bridges, and the homeless kids, the street children, live under these bridges. They're taking some of these over and making them into state-of-the-art dormitories, beautiful, not just, you know, ordinary shelters. And they're going to introduce children from the more privileged schools to come and teach them cricket, which cricket is the big game there. And they're constant programs right the way through Pakistan to try and bring these two sectors so that the privileged people realize how privileged they are, and bridges are beginning to be formed.
What would it take for Brussels to join that network of cities of compassion?
What you need to do is you need to get petitions, so that petitions are collected, about 1,000 signatures.
1,000 signatures.
And then you take it to the mayor.
There's 400 of us today.
Yeah, and take it to the mayor. In Karachi, it was the children from the schools who did this. Yeah. And they set up Compassionate Karachi, and it was the first document in the history of the nation which has had an input from so many people.
Wow.
And then you have to have a project.
I remember you mentioned once a project to me, and I think it could be highly appropriate for Brussels. It was compassionate driving.
Yes. That's in Karachi there. Compassionate driving is
How do I become a compassionate driver?
Well, I'm unable to tell you that because as an epileptic, I'm unable to drive.
It's perhaps the best way then. But as a driver, if I have a driving license, how can my driving become more compassionate?
Think of other people on the road. Don't honk your horns. I mean, travelling around Karachi is a pretty hairy experience, I have to say. And not as bad as travelling, being driven in Iran, however, which is absolutely terrifying.
Have you been to Congo?
No.
Right.
Not yet, no. But considering other people on the road, and that's quite a practice.
As fellow human beings.
As fellow human beings.
Who are also in a hurry.
Also in a hurry, also stressed, also had a bad day.
Right.
Yes, and I'd like to introduce compassionate cyclists, because in London they're positively lethal Well, they think they're so green that they don't need to observe things like red lights, or and pedestrians like me often get mowed down. So.
Can you, perhaps to finish, can you tell us a little bit how the charter was drafted? You brought together a bunch of people in Switzerland, yes. I believe.
Ted did.
Ted did.
We wanted to, at first we thought this would be a religious thing. In fact, it's not now particularly religious, right. But it began that way. And we wanted to get people from a range of religions. As I said, I was tired of seeing religious leaders coming together and never mentioning compassion. Right. That we get leading activists and thinkers in a range of faiths to come together. We came together in Switzerland, and they were from Christianity of different sorts, Judaism, Islam, different sorts, a Confucian, Hindus and Buddhists. And together we sat for 2 days.
How many people?
I think there were about 30.
30 of you?
Around a table. And we sat round and said what we wanted to be in that charter. Then I sent out drafts. We communicated by email until we'd got what everybody was happy to sign up on. Right. And then we launched it in 60 different regions of the world.
I suggest we finish this interview with my invitation to you if you want to read the charter for us.
Glasses.
Yes, but you don't have...
Let's see what I can do. I probably manage that.
I printed it in a very big font.
Yes, I can
is that
do
doable?
Yes, it is.
And ladies and gentlemen, there will be time for question. I make a small suggestion. Let Karen read the Charter for Compassion. Let us have half a minute of silence to let it sink it in afterwards. Then we give you a big applause, and then we go over to questions.
The principle of compassion lies at the heart of all religious, ethical, and spiritual traditions, calling us always to treat all others as we wish to be treated ourselves. Compassion impels us to work tirelessly to alleviate the suffering of our fellow creatures, to dethrone ourselves from the center of our world and put another there, and to honor the inviolable sanctity of every single human being, treating everybody without exception, with absolute justice, equity, and respect. It is also necessary in both public and private life to refrain consistently and empathically from inflicting pain, to act or speak violently out of spite, chauvinism, or self-interest, to impoverish, exploit, or deny basic rights to anybody, and to incite hatred by denigrating others, even our enemies, is a denial of our common humanity. We acknowledge that we have failed to live compassionately, and that some have even increased the sum of human misery in the name of religion. We therefore call upon all men and women to restore compassion to the center of morality and religion, to return to the ancient principle that any interpretation of Scripture that breeds violence, hatred, or disdain is illegitimate, to ensure that youth are given accurate and respectful information about other traditions, religions, and cultures, to encourage a positive appreciation of cultural and religious diversity, to cultivate an informed empathy with the suffering of all human beings, even those regarded as enemies. We urgently need to make compassion a clear, luminous, and dynamic force in our polarized world, rooted in a principled determination to transcend selfishness. Compassion can break down political, dogmatic, ideological, and religious boundaries. Born of our deep interdependence, compassion is essential to human relationships and to a fulfilled humanity. It is the path to enlightenment and indispensable to the creation of a just economy and a peaceful global community.
Thank you so much, Karen Armstrong. Ladies and gentlemen, we have 2 microphones and many questions. Please be quick and remember, a question is a phrase with an intonation at the end.
Hello, thank you for your talk.
Could you stand up, please?
Over here. Yeah, I've just got something on me. So, it's a very interesting discussion. I'm struck that in the West, religious practice has more or less collapsed. And people might say that's a good thing, or people can't accept the traditional scripture, traditional churchly authority, but they have done studies of people having religious experiences. It affects the same part of the brain as sex and drugs. It's very powerful experiences, probably to do with purpose and community. And I wonder, do you have any thoughts on how to rekindle spiritual practice in a way which gives people more purpose in their lives? Because I think that's what's missing today. Thank you.
Very clear question. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I think one of the things to do is to stop saying that religious people have to believe things. This is a new fashion. Religion is always about doing things. There's no belief system in Buddhism, for example. The Buddha would have said this was unskillful, and he always refused to say, he'd always adapt his teaching to anything to get the truth across. All the scriptures that I've been studying at the moment continually make something new. Instead of harking back to what the original text was and what we've got to believe, they were saying, how do we adapt these scriptures to make them speak to this current situation, often changing them drastically? The word belief in English has changed its meaning. It comes from believin, the Old English, which meant to commit yourself. It meant loyalty. Credo comes from cordare, to give your heart. And so believer and credo, you give your heart to God, not you believe that there's a deity out there. And all the, it's only in the 18th century that people like Newton changed the subject of belief and made it an intellectual acceptance of a rather dubious proposition. So it stopped people believing things. We can say nothing about God. And I've written whole books about this, showing all the major theologians, as I said earlier, said Thomas Aquinas' huge work can all be seen as an endless attempt to explain that when we talk about God, we don't know what we're talking about. He gave 5 proofs for God's existence. They're famous. But no one reads the next bit. Having said that God is the first mover, the prime, the highest excellence, etc., and proving it a la Aristotle, he then says, but we don't know what it is we've proved. All we've shown is the existence of a mystery, and a mystery means mystery. We don't know what we're talking about, because there is mystery in life. As Einstein said when he looked at the universe, it's beyond us. And transcendence means transcendence. So stop getting people to say, do you believe in God? Or, you know, that's not what it was about. Jesus did not go around asking people to believe that he was the second person of the Trinity. He was going around asking them to be generous, to be kind, to live according to the golden rule, to treat all others equally. And the Prophet Muhammad, the same. The Quran has no time for dogma, which it calls zanna, self-indulgent guesswork, about matters that no one can be certain of one way or the other, that makes people quarrelsome. He said, religion is about doing things, about engaging in rituals which are works of art that give one a sense of transcendence, as great art does, a sense of wonder and awe, not a sense that you know it all or learned all this nonsense that, in catechisms and things. And it's about acting differently. And when you act differently and consistently, you change. It changes you. So if we could just get back to a sense of transcendence, awe, and wonder, that's what I mean by sacralizing the cosmos. Not that we see that there's a God, a ridiculous idea, up there orchestrating everything, but this is a profound and extraordinary mystery to us, that it fills us with wonder, awe, and reverence. And when we meet other human beings, in the Hindus, for example, say every human being is essentially divine. And when they greet each other like that, they are bowing to the divinity that they are encountering one another. These practices help to build up a sense of awe and respect and wonder, not belief.
Thank you. There is a lady on the third row, which I would like to give the microphone to. Some people will be frustrated because we will not be able to give everyone a microphone, but we'll try to be as concise as possible. Please.
So, if you agree,
can you stand up, please?
Yeah. Can I ask my question in French? Maybe you can translate.
Sure, go ahead.
Alors, moi, je m'appelle Marie, et moi, je suis croyante, catholique romaine, and I believe in God. Donc, je ne vais pas questionner les croyances de Madame, mais ce que je voudrais savoir, c'est, bon, elle a fait un enseignement, elle a une charte, oui. Elle a une règle d'or. Oui. Donc, pour moi, c'est une religion, parce qu'une religion, c'est une religion syncrétique. Parce oui. Qu'une religion, c'est nous dire ce que nous devons croire, okay. Par rapport à ce qui se trouve en haut. Okay. Donc je ne vais pas discuter la croyance, yeah. Ni ces concepts avec lesquels je ne suis pas d'accord, vous le comprendrez, mais je pose la question, right. Est-ce que ce qu'elle nous propose n'est pas une religion syncrétique yeah. Avec ses rites?
So,
merci.
The lady is called Mary, she's Roman Catholic, she's a believer. She was interested in hearing your talk and she was wondering whether the Charter for Compassion and what you stand for, whether it can be seen as a syncretic form of religion.
Yes, I suppose you could see it like that, but I don't think it's just about to do with religion either. I think this is about humanity as much as anything else. You see, the Chinese would say that humanity itself is religion. Their great virtue is Ren, which is humanity, which means compassion. And so that there is this within all of us. We have this yearning for compassion. We recognize it when we see it. And the fact that all these traditions came up with the idea of compassion shows that it's deeply embedded in our human nature. So that I would see it as a form of certainly a fulfillment of religion, but not a question of we all got to chorale together.
It's not a new religion?
It's not a new religion. Let's all be different, if we like, right. Not syncretized, right. But let us all be humane.
Good, very clear. The gentleman over there with the light blue jumper.
Thank you, Mr. Armstrong, for your very interesting talk, very inspiring. I also personally feel appealed by your Charter of Compassion. If it could work, because this is my question, could it not be better to substitute the word compassion by the word solidarity, not just as a semantic question, but is it feasible to base our ethical behavior on an emotion like compassion, empathy? Is it not better to base it on an idea, the idea of solidarity?
Thank you. Yes.
It's a very good question. I'm glad you asked it. Because we have a lot of problems with the word compassion. It's got kind of soft in the way we use it. And it is, as you say, as you rightly say, associated with feeling. I am not talking about feeling, emotion. Certainly you can feel emotion, but not always. Your emotions depend upon how much sleep you had last night, or the state of your digestion, or all kinds of things. It's a willed attitude where you recognize the respect for other people, and think of others before yourself as a habit.
And this can be nurtured.
And we can develop this as we develop other skills. And learn other skills. We all, we all have to learn how to study, how to drive, how to, do a number of things. We have to learn to be compassionate. The word compassion, it comes from a Greek and Latin root, kompathein, to feel or to endure with the other. To put, so that you see the other as the same, different from mercy. In other traditions, al-rahim in Arabic is related to the etymologically related to the word for womb, and that introduces the idea of mother love. And you see the mother and the baby; it's a symbol of our humanity. But mother love is also hard. And there are probably times when a mother wants to murder her child. And she has to get up to it every night, whether she feels like it or not. And she has to, be responsible, know that that child is at every second of the day concerned and putting her own interests to one side. She may not feel like doing it, but that's what she has to do. And then that child grows up and can become a horrible disappointment. But the mother never gives up, remains solid there. It's hard work, and it's not to do with feeling. I agree, it's unfortunate. When I lectured in Holland, I was told they didn't have a word for compassion. And when I gave a speech and it was translated into the paper the next day, someone at the hotel came across, because I'd said it does not mean pity.
And they used the word
pity. They mean pity right the way through. Yeah. It's not about feeling sorry for people. It's about because that's if you're sorry for people, you're putting yourself in a superior position, like mercy or forgiveness. You are just seeing yourself on a level with the other, that they have as much rights as you have in this particular moment.
There's a gentleman over there at the back of the room. Please, yes, please, can you stand up so that I'm pointing to the gentleman with the half-long hair and the glasses. Yes, a little bit further on. You had your hand up? Yes, please, you're the one, yes. You are the chosen one, yes.
My name is Yvonne.
Oh, sorry. I do apologize.
It's okay. Again, thank you very much. It's really a privilege to be able to be here and listen to this conversation. One question I have is, later on you're going to be addressing young people. I'd be really interested to hear what your message or how you want to adapt that message for their ears. And the other thing is maybe a question to the audience. The idea of a compassionate Brussels is fantastic. If the first step is a petition, why not try to get that ball rolling? If there are people here who are interested, maybe we can try to connect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm always at a loss, a bit surprised to be talking to young people, because I don't see many of them. I've not had any children of my own. There aren't, and I've not got many, I belong to a rather dysfunctional family, so I don't see children often, or young people. And we're very conscious about this in the Charter. Because they are having, with the whole internet thing, with electronic media, they're developing a different kind of language, a different kind of ways of thinking. This is, I will sound like some ancient prophet from the past. I was in Boston.
It's okay, I just mistook a lady for a man, so it's okay.
It's something we were talking about, Joan Brown Campbell, who's been managing the Charter, and me for just 2 weeks ago. And there are some younger people now on the board who are business people. They're not particularly religious, and they're full of ideas. And we said, let's put them in charge.
Good.
You do it. And we're going to the World Parliament of Churches. We say, you do the presentation, because we are old. And you will be able to speak to them in a way that we cannot, with the best of our ability. And involve more and more even younger people to put them on the leadership, because it's their world that they've got to inherit what we've left them and somehow make something of it. And we need those insights, because the whole language is changing, you see, just with the internet. The idea that you can make an important remark in 140 characters, for example, is changing the way, changing people's mindset. And somehow we need to get young voices involved. So thank you for that question, because it's something very much on all our minds.
We have time for one final question, and I will refrain from making non-gender neutral statements. The person over there who looks like a lady to me. Please, can you bring the microphone? It's on the left-hand side of your alley. 5 meters down, 4 meters down. Yes, brown shirt.
Hi. In your introduction, you mentioned that people are constantly trying to transform themselves. And do you think there's a certain reason why this is happening, or do you not think we should try to be happy with ourselves as we are, maybe acknowledge our flaws, and then change ourselves for the better? Why do we seek this transformation from religion?
In your introduction, you talked about the transformative power of religion. Why do we seek that transformative power, and how can the Psalms be part of that? We return to the Psalms.
Yes, basically, as human beings, we're constantly trying to transform ourselves. As I say, we have makeovers, our homes are continually redecorated, we have New Year's resolutions where we're going to be a better person from this moment onwards. We're continually trying to perfect ourselves, and religion is part of that, because there are aspects, just like the arts. I see religion as an art form in many ways, which actually enhance our humanity and make us, and enhance the way we perceive the world, and make us see things in a deeper way. And we change. We do change. God would help us if we did not change, but remained the same. But we continually are evolving, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. Now, so religion, people aren't going to It's just part of that. How can the Psalms do it? I was trying to say that in my introduction, that by taking these texts and not making them all about me, you know, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. By taking the angry Psalms and putting yourself in the position of another person who is suffering and angry in this world, and realizing that many people are experiencing this right now, and some of us in privileged countries bear a responsibility for that. That, if you make a habit of that, it changes your outlook. It becomes a transformation. And that's what the scriptures, at their best in the old days, were trying to do, to make you see things from another point of view, to act it out in a different way, and become a more empathic person, instead of somebody endlessly preoccupied with myself.
Ladies and gentlemen, reading the Psalms can transform yourself. Reading Karen Armstrong can have the same effect. Thank you for your attention. Her books are for sale. Thank you so much, Karen.